of carnal love as he's experiencing it and so on. And in so doing, he brings the sonnet down and into the mainstream of the kind of current of English language and letters or whatever. And we may say that from Shakespeare or whatever, there is a kind of trajectory and inheritance, a legacy, which allows for the next generation of John Donne and George Herbert to write their great religious sonnets, and eventually allows for people like Coleridge and Wordsworth to write the romantic sonnets that they write when the sonnet is reinvigorated in the late 18th and early 19th century, among other people by the brilliant Charlotte Smith or whatever, and much neglected female figure of the 18th century who wrote extraordinary sonnets about the position of women, and so on. So Shakespeare is a kind of a linchpin figure. His sonnets are in themselves magnificent, but he is also absolutely fascinating because of the way in which he brings the sonnet into a kind of a different kind of concourse of English letters. Can we ask you to turn off videos and audio so that we don't have background interruptions? Now, this poem is as lucid and rational in its way as the poem that we looked at yesterday, Wolf and Edwecker, simply wasn't. But of course, as you probably all know by now, the sequence to which Shakespeare's sonnet belongs is by no means as lucid and rational as we might expect. It is Shakespeare famously establishing himself in a sequence that is nonetheless shot through with this tormented kind of question of attribution to whom the sonnets are actually addressed. At times it seems this young man, potentially a noble patron, perhaps Southampton, at times the dark lady over whom the identity has been much discussed, and so on and so forth. And of course, scholars of gender and sexual orientation and so on have found a great deal in Shakespeare's sonnets to suggest that there is an encrypted kind of appeal to codes of homosexuality and to all kinds of hidden resonances, which make the sonnet or the sonnet sequence of Shakespeare's or whatever from all kinds of other angles an extraordinarily interesting and often impenetrable particular exercise. In fact, we might think back to Wolf and Edwecker or whatever, now that you've had a glance at it or whatever, and just think of just how much of that particular poem depends, for example, upon the certainty or the uncertainty, as we receive it, of the gender of the figure of Edwecker, whom we're told by linguists or whatever is likely a masculine name or whatever. But the gender of Edwecker makes the whole sonnet swing in different directions. If Edwecker is a female figure, the sonnet would read differently, and so on and so forth. Well, the same is true of Shakespeare's sequence or whatever. The attribution or the donation of the sonnets, the direction in which they're donated, makes the sonnets peculiarly strange and difficult and perhaps different in ways which the kind of coterie sonneteers like Wyatt and the gang, whatever, might have found peculiar in themselves. We're discovering something new, perhaps, about poetry, or unnew since we looked at Wolf and Edwecker last week, and that is that it is so cussedly difficult so much of the time. Nonetheless, what we have at hand fundamentally is a sonnet. And that's something all of us probably know. And it makes our prosodic analysis, the analysis of the craft of the poem, to which I'm going to turn today as a kind of object lesson, and perhaps to kind of elucidate some of this particular sonnet's brilliance around the themes of love and death, whatever, that much easier. We need to attend to several simple things. We need to attend to the shape of the sonnet, the famous 14-linedness of that particular creature. We need to attend to its stanza structure, its 4 quatrains, and its concluding couplet. We need to attend to its rhymes, because sonnets famously rhyme, either A, B, B, A, or A, A, B, B, or A, B, A, B, and so on and so forth. We needn't fuss too much about that, but we need to look at those rhymes and how they work. We need to look at its meter. Okay, that is the formal rhythmic device which is set up and established in the practice of the sonnet, and which we all remember from school is iambic pentameter, but which exists really as a default against which the sonneteer can use, in this case his, but also her, particular talents to disrupt in ways which cause new meanings to erupt from the text for us in ways that enliven the sonnet and sometimes contradict its apparent meaning. And we need to look at what we call in English literary studies its tropes. That's its metaphorical kind of conventions of imagery. We were talking last week, for example, yesterday, how time flies. We were talking yesterday about the particular trope that attends so much English poetry of the island and the islanded nature of the subject or the soul or whatever, hemmed in by the kind of outer life, the pre-life or the afterlife of the ocean that lies beyond it. And we find that right back in Old English, in the Seafarer, in Wolfe and Edwacker, and so on and so forth. And we find it all the way down to Samuel Taylor Coleridge in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and to, let me think of somebody else, Matthew Arnold in Dover Beach, staring out at the sea and so on. That sense of an islanded subjectivity is tremendously important. It's an established metaphor within the current of English poetry and what we call a trope. It recurs again and again, and it's obviously modulated each time, the gut of the poem or whatever, emerging differently or whatever, but nonetheless something that has gone back to, and which always, as it were, calls down in each instance all the preceding occasions, whatever, that have shaped its occasion in the poem at hand, and so on. But the very first thing we need to note about any sonnet is that it belongs to a particularly patriarchal and hegemonic tradition. And this is tremendously important from the point of view of feminist scholarship in the 20th and 21st century. The sonnet is preeminently, at least up until Shakespeare's time, it's beginning to change. We're beginning to get women sonneteers even in Shakespeare's time. And as I said, we find brilliant ones by the time we get down to the 18th century. And we've got exceptional ones in the 20th and 21st century. It is by no means exclusively a male prerogative, but it is initially exclusively a male prerogative. And it initially always involves this male figure, this patriarchal male figure, utilizing the language, taking the language as his prerogative in order to enact a beseeching, position from that of the lover, to that of the impassive beloved, who is the female figure in the sonnet. And that particular posture of beseeching, often, despite that apparent actual power or whatever, pretending to a condition of haplessness and hopelessness, is always in fact engaged, I would argue, and many scholars with me, in kinds or modes of emotional blackmail that are in fact aggressive, in which hostages are taken of the beseeched, impassive beloved. And I think this poem is no different in that, in many, many ways. In many ways, this poem takes the lover's argument to extremes and says, if you don't love me or whatever, I'm going to die, as it were. I'm going to go away somewhere and die. You're going to eat some worms. If you don't love me, I'll die, and then you'll really miss me, and so on and so forth. So it pulls the biggest trick in the hat out of that particular hat, whatever, and utilizes it to secure the kind of object of that particular posture, which is to secure the love of the beloved figure. You'd better love me, it says, despite my aging, because I'm going to die. And it pulls death really as a kind of a threat against the beloved object. In every way, we would like to say it's unfair in many, many senses. And I want to highlight that right at the beginning, because I think as beautiful as Shakespeare's sonnets are, they still persist or still consist in the particular problematic of the hegemonic and patriarchal address of the beseeching, putatively hapless lover or whatever, who is in fact taking emotional hostage of the beloved, who has, as it were, no right of response, not belonging to the male coteries in which these sonnets are in the first instance circulated. And that brings us, I think, to the very first of our prosodic considerations, which is of the shape of the sonnet itself. When I lecture about sonnets to undergraduates, I frequently carry a 10 Rand note in my pocket. And I hold it up and I show students that a 10 Rand note, or the shape of the palm of one's hand itself, is not very different from the shape of a sonnet in its being. The 14 lines of a sonnet more or less configure the shape of a hand. They more or less configure the kind of bill that a 10 Rand note is. And it's important as a rhetorical device in my lectures because it suggests very much the extent to which sonnets function as a kind of currency in the first issue. In the first kind of instance where they are moving in coteries and underwriting this kind of business of the assignations and affirmations of alliance in the matter of arranged marriages and in the shifting power allegiances of the European courts, whatever. They function as a kind of currency. And I think that that's kind of important because the sonnet arises at the same time as money, and particularly paper money, does in the European economies of the Renaissance. There is something kindred, okay, about the coming of the sonnet and the coming of paper currency. Both of these are modes of modes of ciphers of exchange and the exchange of important value. And I think that that's a useful idea to keep in mind, at least just to, as it were, fertilize your sense of the sonnet as we go forward. This shape of the sonnet, though, in our instance, I think is going to become important because of the particularly hand-like shape of that particular creature. There is something so handy about the sonnet. Now, I want us to bear that in mind because Shakespeare turns a great deal of the sonnet on the first of all his rhymes and the first of all his word plays, which occurs at the end of that very first line. That time of year thou mayst in me behold. Okay, a word, a verb, which speaks to the act of seeing. To behold something is to see something, but also, of course, carries within it latent this tactile or haptic function of the verb hold. That time of year thou mayst in me behold. And of course, the organ of the body that does the act of holding is the hand. And right in that instance, whatever, Shakespeare is suggesting that the eye of the beloved, okay, is entailed in a certain sense in an obligation not simply to see, but also to extend a hand to the hand that is holding the sonnet, to receive from the holding hand of the sonnet, to hold that sonnet in its hand and read it, and so too to take the hand of the writer, okay, which has held the pen, and to hold that hand in the act of love. So that handiness in the shape of the sonnet, as it is recapitulated in this extraordinary wordplay that Shakespeare manages to enforce in that very first rhyming word, left sentinel at the end of the first line of that clarion opening of this famous sonnet, that time of year thou mayst in me behold, I think stands out and stands significant in the way in which the sonnet works all of its rhetorical advices around the kind of conjuring of love that the poet has in hand as a brokerage at the moment. So let's bear that very strongly and strictly in mind, that this sonnet is a hand held out, okay? It holds out the handy shape of the sonnet for the reception of the reader, but it also holds out the hand to be held by the beloved in the act of love itself, as the first act of love itself. The sonnet is in every way deft and handy. We turn then to the substructure or the subshape of the sonnet, which is characterized by what we conventionally call the Shakespearean form. There are 3 quatrains followed by a couplet, and those 3 quatrains concern themselves with 3 conventional tropes of the sonnet, slightly modulated by Shakespeare's genius. He's always a little bit ahead of the game, but they're there and they look after themselves fairly obviously to your reading, and I'm sure that you can spot them as quickly as I can. The first quatrain concerns itself with the time of year that thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which late against the cold, and so on and so forth. The second quatrain, okay, belongs to a concern with the time of day instead of the time of year. And the third quatrain belongs to the temporality of the fire, okay, which is a smaller part of the day, okay, in some senses a measure of the day, because of course a fire would be kept burning throughout the day, such as I have to do with the stove downstairs to keep this cold farmhouse warm, whatever. That fire needs to be tended. It blazes up in the morning when I blow on it. It dies down at night. I rake the ashes in the night and I blow up from the embers of it in the morning, the new fire for the new day. So it is in its own way a kind of orological or kind of temporal measure of the way in which the day works. And then finally, we have the famous couplet to which we'll recur right at the end. Let's have a look at the sonnet and read it through at this stage, just so that we're all on the same page. I hope that you've got in front of you the same text I have. That time of year thou mayst in me behold. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire, that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. As I suggested, it's not a difficult poem to understand. Fundamentally, he says, you can see in me, okay, that I'm aging like the time of year. It's autumn, going for winter. He says, you can see in me the kind of time of day, okay, it's sunset, it's the end of day, whatever, death's second self, okay, sealing up all in rest, I'm heading towards that. Then he says, you can see the glowing of a fire that's dying down on the ashes of its days, kind of burning or whatever, and which are going to, in fact, smother the fire overnight, consume that, okay, which it was nourished by, and then concludes by saying, you see all of this, and then answers, and here's the volta or the twist in the sonnet, as we famously come to expect, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. Okay, I may be decrepit, I may be old, I may be sunset, I may be a bare and empty tree, I may be an ash smothered fire or whatever, but you'd better love me hard, and you'd better love me now, because I am going to go soon. Okay, so all of these ciphers of the passing of time, okay, become impressed upon the beloved in this emotional hostage taking as reasons to get on with the act of loving early and now and immediately, and in that famous, wonderful, powerful rhyme setup in the final couplet, strong and long, okay, which I will come back to, I'm sure, in a short while. Let's see if I can return myself to the screen. Can people see me? I should be filling the screen again. I'm hoping so.
No, not yet.
You can't see me?
Not yet. Can you stop presenting?
Yes, I can see you, but only tiny.
Peter, you need to stop sharing your screen.
There we go.
Great.
Okay.
Am I big and ugly again?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Delighted. Okay, so following the logic of the subshape of the sonnet through the various tropes that attend those four stanzas, the three quatrains and the final couplet, is not a difficult exercise. It doesn't pose for us the kinds of intractable problems of the refusing kind of logic that we find in something like Wolf and Edwack or whatever, compounded by problems of translation and so on. We're looking now at an English that we would consider more or less modern. We're looking at an extremely lucid and rational mind in the case of Shakespeare, setting out an argument that is almost irrefutably simple in the way in which it works for us, and which is as handy, I'm going to use that word once again, on our kind of cognitive practice as the sonnet is handy in its shape and in its distributive kind of context from hand to hand in the act of reading, because we must remember that the first iteration of all these sonnets would have been on a single piece of paper passed from the lover to the beloved, or in Shakespeare's case, from the beseeching young middle class or middle-aged middle class aspirant to the patron Southampton, or whoever the sonnet is in fact addressed to. We can't quite be sure of that. But in that first stanza, there are several things that I think are worth having a quick squiz at. And I'm going to cut back to that page, and I'm going to ask Lorato and Zuleika to keep an eye on getting me back to normal when we're done or whatever, because I want to, where is that? Where is my, I can't find my screen. It doesn't matter. So long as you've got the screen or whatever, I can make the points without it in front of me. So let's do that nonetheless, without looking at it. The first thing that I want to draw your attention to is to that verb behold. And I've done that already, and I've done that substantially, but I want to reiterate it because I think that the sonnet hangs on the holding, okay, metaphor, or the holding pun, or whatever. That's tremendously important. In that final line, that holding, that beholding is going to become perceived. Okay, a different, more Latin version, okay, of the old Anglo-Saxon verb to behold. Okay, we're going to move to a more Latinate verb meaning the same thing, to perceive something, whatever. So in the first instance, it's the act of sight, but all the way through, Shakespeare is looking very strongly at the way in which the act of seeing, in the instance of a sonnet, is also the act of holding, and in this case, the act of holding hands. And I think that's a tremendously important point to make. The second thing that I think should have stuck out for some of you is this marvelous inversion in the second line. He says, that time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few do hang upon those boughs. And the strict order of that particular line, were that line to be mimetic, in other words, to be enacting the passage of time in the life of a tree heading towards winter, would be that time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, their leaves, or few leaves, or few, or none, and they're all gone, do hang. But Shakespeare actually inverts that particular order in order to introduce a little concession, which is both deft and I think very, very voluble to the meaning of the poem. When yellow leaves, or none, hang on, one moment, or few, there are few still, okay? And in that moment, we get the slightly poignant, heart-wrenching moment where we see the speaker of the sonnet say, I'm old, but actually I'm not that old. Look, there are some hairs on my head still, okay? There is still life in the old dog yet. Okay, and that's accomplished by this deft little switch in the natural order, where we would expect a tree full of leaves to become a tree with few leaves, which would become a tree with no leaves. Instead, we get a tree full of leaves becoming a tree with no leaves, becoming, hang on, go back a bit, a tree with some leaves. Okay, and in that we get, just in that word order, okay, we get the implicit rather than the explicit argument that this individual is perhaps not as old as the posture of the poem sets him out to be, okay? And in that we get this plaintive kind of appeal to the remnants of youth, okay? But we also get what is going to recur all the way through the sonnet, the promise of some kind of restoration of leaves, because there is a natural order in which we move from a tree with leaves to a tree with no leaves to a tree with some leaves. And that is the order in which a tree goes from summer to winter, and not to autumn, which doesn't come after winter, but instead to spring. And I want to suggest that this sonnet has lurking within it, although it expounds again and again this inclination towards sunset, towards winter, towards the expiring of a fire, it nonetheless manages in these small instances to encrypt moments of hope where the promise of spring is very, very faintly, very, very latently left lying in the word order or the arrangement or the implications of the tropes, those extended and conventional metaphors that the poem falls back on. And that, of course, gives hope to the summatory project of the poem itself. That, of course, as this poem argues, your love may be dying for me because I'm getting old, but you've got to love me because I'm going to die. There is another argument. Your love may be dying for me, but everything that dies comes back again. There is an afterlife. There is after spring, after winter, spring. Okay? And that kind of argument, okay, never explicit, I hasten to add that, never explicit, is everywhere implicit, and nowhere more so, as we'll come to see in the final stanza of this particular sonnet. I want to notice again also in this particular first stanza the famous reference to the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet bird sang. That I want to note simply because many of you might remember from your undergraduate careers or your time at school or whatever, is often taken to be a reference to the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Okay, and that Shakespeare is in fact making a reference or having recourse to an imagery to the landscape of the dissolved monasteries of Britain, where the great abbeys and monasteries have been shut down, looted and pillaged or whatever for their silver and whatever other value they've got, or whatever, and are now bare, ruined, and the choir stalls, okay, are empty of the choristers that once sang in them. So here the image of the bird sitting on these empty branches, empty of trees or whatever, becomes conflated with the landscape of an England, okay, in which the monasteries were once populated by choristers singing in the choir stalls that have now fallen silent after the dissolution of the monasteries during the Reformation, okay, undertaken by Henry VIII in pursuit of the divorce by which he was enabled to marry Anne Boleyn or whatever, in pursuit of an heir or whatever it was that was driving his particular political ambitions at that particular moment. So again, really what I'm trying to kind of pull out here for us is a sense of the way in which this particular sonnet, as rational and as denotatively finite and easy in many senses to read at first glance, love me because I'm going to die and then you'll miss me, it says, is in fact involving all kinds of things, the politics of England, okay, doctrines of resurrection, the coming of spring, okay, plaintive small hopes that you might notice that I'm not as old as I in fact was, okay, all accomplished by subtle inversions of words or whatever, or images, okay, of birds sitting on empty branches conflated with the landscape of the dissolved monasteries of England, okay, landscapes that would of course been highly visible to the Shakespearean audience, even if they're not as visible to us now 4 or 5 centuries later. So those are marvelous kinds of things to pick up. Let's move from those kind of stanzaic tropes or whatever for 5 seconds, just to consider some of the rhyme work that's going on in the sonnet, in the way in which Shakespeare works it from the outset. The second stanza, let's use that as a stanza for present purposes, rhymes the words day with away and west with rest. These are very conventional rhymes working very well with the fundamental project of the poem, which is mimetically to suggest the decline of nature, whether across seasons, okay, or across days or across the lifespan of a fire. We've got the kind of inclination or trajectory in these particular rhymes as telegrams of the kind of declining temporality of the experience of humankind across years, across days, across the night in which a fire burns down. Okay, days go away into night. The west, okay, is where the sun sets, okay, and is therefore connotative of death and so on and so forth. And it rhymes here with rest, eternal rest, where death takes place, and so on and so forth. So once again, we find, as so very often, that the rhymes, these words left hanging on the end of the sentences, can almost be read down from the top of the poem to the bottom of the poem to supply us with a 14-word, okay, just those rhyme words, a 14-word telegram, okay, that tells us the kind of implicit meaning of the poem all the way through. I'm intrigued by all kinds of things. I'm glancing at my notebook as I read here, and I've noticed all kinds of fascinating things, like the use of the verb, not the verb, the use of the preposition against in the first stanza of the poem, and noticing that is in itself a peculiar kind of shake against the cold. Not shake in the cold or shake with the cold or shake because of the cold, which all seem natural logic things, natural and logical. This is shaking against the cold, okay? So that there is some sort of act of defiance, okay? Even in the dead branches or the bare leaves, you know, the last leaves, the few that are still hanging upon the boughs, whatever. This is, you know, connotative to me or echoes for me or whatever. Dylan Thomas's "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should rage at close of day." You know, rage against the dying of the light. We've got this sense of this kind of old Lyrian type figure, whatever, to use a Shakespearean example, kind of shaking its fist all of a sudden against the fact of mortality, the fact of death, the fact of aging, okay? And it's all turned in the deft hand of Shakespeare, the genius of Shakespeare, just on the use of a different preposition instead of with or because of or whatever the case may be, against. And the whole poem changes subtly on its course because of doing that. In the second stanza, day becomes away, west becomes rest, and we have this trajectory of conventional pairings of rhymes or whatever, all setting out a kind of configuration of an argument of loss, pairings of rhymes conducive towards a sensing of loss. But let's look and think momentarily about the final couplet and the very powerful, very, very powerful, explicitly powerful rhymes which occur in that couplet, where Shakespeare rhymes strong with long. Now, this is a particularly important instance of rhyme and the way in which rhyme works in the hand of Shakespeare's contrariety, in the way in which he's writing something explicit but also writing something implicit in this particular sonnet. Because the sonnet argues in that last line that you're going to have to leave me before very long. Before long, I'm going to be dead, okay? Which thou must leave ere long, okay? And in that sense, or whatever, that sense of ere long, in fact, means shortly, okay? And means the very opposite of in a long time. It means in a short time. You're going to have to leave me in a very short space of time because I'm going to die shortly. But nonetheless, rhymed as the word long is with the word above it, strong, okay? We get a strong sense of the word long, okay? And are left instead in the kind of oral syntax of the rhyme scheme of the poem with the impression of a love which, far from being, as it were, susceptible to the temporality and fragilities, okay, that aging and mortality impose upon the human bond of love, is nonetheless, instead of being, as it were, weakened and withering in consequence of all of that, somehow strengthened and lengthened. And this love, precisely because of aging and mortality, is made, instead of being weaker, okay, and more fragile or inclined to demise, instead something that is left strong and long. Those are the echoing rhymes that we take away with us after the poem is finished. The last two bells to sound in our ears are strong and long, profoundly optimistic, profoundly affirmative, affirming suggestions of the nature of the love between the lover in this instance and the beloved, whomever they may be in the sequence that we have before us. So once again, we've got a kind of a trajectory from strong, okay, to the shortness or brevity ere long in the literal syntax of that particular line, to something very different in the oral syntax, which suggests the lastingness of this particular love in the logic of the rhyme association that's been set up in the poem for us. Lastly, and for me always the most fun, we need to attend a little bit to the meter of the poem. And this is where we have a kind of comfort zone, okay, because we know that when we're dealing with a sonnet, we're dealing with iambic pentameter. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, da-dum, 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 da-dum. And in part, that kind of consolatory, easygoing, easy predictable, close to natural speech rhythm, iambic pentameter, conduces towards what is so rational and easily accessible about this particular poem. It assists Shakespeare in making this particular very simple argument. You've got to love me even though I'm growing old, because I'm not going to be around for very long or whatever, so you better love me hard and love me now. Okay, simple argument, takes its emotional hostages, takes them deftly, takes them clearly, and so on and so forth. Very easy. And the iambic pentameter with its simple declarative da-dum, 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 seems rhythmically to set that kind of thinking out in an inviolable kind of a way. It's absolutely easily understood. It's as easy as da-dum, 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 okay, as strolling down the carpet. Okay, but of course the whole poem doesn't utilize iambic pentameter. As I've said, iambic pentameter is the default. That is the meter of the poem, but frequently the rhythm of the poem breaks the meter of the poem. The meter is that conventional rhythm laid down as the default, okay, upon which the entire structure of the poem's rhythmic force is hung, but which the poet breaks or breaches at times in cases where he wishes to produce a different effect. And perhaps the most effective moment for me of all of this would be the line that goes, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. We do not have there a line that goes, bare ruined choirs where I can't even do it. Bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. It doesn't work at all, okay, to fit it into iambic pentameter. Instead, that line begins with 3 stressed syllables. Bare ruined choirs. It's not da-dum, it's dum, dum, dum. Where late the sweet, there we have da-dum, okay? And then birds sang. So the last 3 syllables of that particular line are also stressed. What we've got, okay, is bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. Dum, 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 da-dum, da-dum, dum, dum. These very powerful stresses at the front of the line, these very powerful stresses echoed at the back of the line. And this intrigues me and pleases me, it delights me once again with the genius of the poet that we're dealing with, because it cuts both ways. On the one hand, in some ways, this disruption of the metrical expectation of iambic pentameter produces for us a rhythm which echoes something like a wind itself echoing, blowing through the emptiness of the dissolved monasteries or the empty branches of the trees, okay? Not having the leaves to rustle against and produce those small staccato, finite, unstressed syllabic sounds. Empty of that short tripping song of birds, as it were, singing in staccato in spring. So we have this kind of woo, 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 do-do, do-do, woo, 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 windy effect brought about by the disruption of the iambic pentameter with this different stressed rhythm of the spondee at the beginning of the line and the spondee at the end of the line, these stressed syllables. But in other ways, one might argue the exact opposite. One might argue that this particular line, in its explicit musicality, in the way in which it, as it were, moves away from the repetitious predictability of iambic pentameter's simple, rather boring kind of march through the syllables of the poem, to-dum, 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 to-dum. This, one might argue, in a way repopulates the bare branches of the trees, repopulates the empty choir stalls of the dissolved monasteries of the landscape of Reformation England with song, and the song of this particular bird, okay? So in a funny kind of a way, instead of hearing da-dum, 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 which is a boring bird song, we hear something much more like the kind of call a bird establishing its territory much more emphatically in not winter, not autumn, but spring, the breeding season, might be making as the sound from those particular branches. Okay, woot, 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 doot, doot, woot, woot, woot. All of a sudden, we might have wind blowing, emptiness, bare choirs, but we might also be having those choirs repopulated by the genius of Shakespeare's manipulation of the rhythm of this particular poem, against the default meter of iambic pentameter, to produce something, once again, subliminally and implicitly to do with the repopulation of those branches and choirs by choristers or by robins or warblers or whatever birds are going to repopulate the bare branches of the trees when a few leaves once again rehang upon them come spring. So once again, deeply, deeply underwriting the poem, buried away, hidden away, okay? So deep as to be only implicit, only susceptible of the kind of argument I'm making, nowhere explicit in Shakespeare's argument, and nowhere does it matter whether he meant it or not, because he's dead and we can't phone him up and ask him whether it's true or not. Nonetheless, I as a critic find in the poem these ciphers, okay, of the way in which spring is going to reinvigorate the branches of these bare trees, or the way in which the religious pulse of England is once again going to bring song okay, to the now depopulated choir stalls, okay, of reformational puritanical England at the time. We get the same effects in different ways at different points throughout the sonnet. We could find other instances. This thou perceivest, this thou, okay, is a double stressed foot in the meter of the poem, and is once again a spondee. Once again, it's mimetic. It acts out the blowing of the wind and so on and so forth. So it's there, and it's behaving in ways that are predictable to us in all kinds of useful and explicit senses. The sonnet does what the sonnet sets out to do. There's no doubt about that. But I'm hoping to suggest to you that there are ways in which this sonnet is suggesting something slightly different about love and death as well. Now, in some senses, it's perhaps worthwhile expostulating a little bit about the problematic of love and death. And I mentioned yesterday Leopardi, the great early 19th century Italian poet who said destiny in a single moment forged love and death or whatever. And I used that Quaker wisdom about death never being got over but gone into, and the wisdom of this ex-girlfriend of mine who said, and of course what one finds when one goes into it, there is love itself. It is true, certainly, that death might be argued to, as it were, sweeten the occasion of human life or whatever, and create this compulsion towards love one another. As W.H. Auden said, we must love one another or die, a line which he himself rejected angrily later in life because he said it was a lie. We must love one another and die. And in so doing, as it were, disavowed Shakespeare's argument in this particular and famous sonnet. It's true that it is against the fact of our mortality that we are more inclined to construct some of the most powerful, potent emotional contracts of our lives, the lives that those contracts of the kind that we would call by the name love, whatever that must mean. And it's a very difficult thing to really talk about. It's also true that death occasions for us a great love of things that lie beyond simply one another. We're talking in this instance here, in this poem or whatever, implicitly about the love between a lover and a beloved in the erotic romantic sense of things. By the time we finish this little course, whatever, we'll be looking at the love between a son and his mother. We're going to look tomorrow at a much more abstracted poem or whatever, where the love is the love of all people and so on and so forth. And it's certainly true that, of course, death and the fact of our mortality or whatever inclines us the more to love life in various ways. But the inversion of that is also true. The extent to which we love life, we love sunlight and we love cucumbers and we love apples on trees. I'm recapitulating a great woman poet of antiquity, Praxilla, at this stage, who enumerated what she would miss when she died. And she said, first sun and moon and stars, then cucumbers and ripe apples. Because we love these things, come so to dread death. Okay, what makes death so appalling to us, whatever, is not in itself to sleep, perchance to dream, that Shakespearean notion, okay, of a long kind of anesthetic version, perhaps ghost haunted, which is a bit scary should purgatory exist or whatever. But I mean, if death is, as the Epicureans see it, simply the end of things, whatever, and we're unconscious of it, there is nothing therein to be afraid of. In the famous title of Julian Barnes's book, Nothing to be Afraid of. Nothing to be afraid of. And so many of us are. The trouble is that because we love so much, there is something to love in almost everything we find in life. Even the suffering that we experience in love or whatever is something we can be half in love with. And we know this because we see our own teenagers in love with being in love. Even the kind of heartrending moments, whatever, of tears shed on their own pillows, whatever, okay? We see individuals in love with the business of being alive. And it's because of that, to some extent, that we share in a horror of death, because it's the denial or the absence, okay, the removal, the recusal, the refusal, okay, of that particular potential. This sonnet doesn't investigate that, okay, in quite the same way that Wolf and Edwerk, I think, in its music did, although we couldn't get very deeply into that because that poem so refuses us, coming to us as it does in a different language. Tomorrow, in what torn ship soever I embark, that ship shall be to me an emblem of thy ark. I think we might perhaps be beginning to get inside the theological knot of love, okay, and death, and the peculiarity of the problem of grace that might perhaps link the two in ways that we can perhaps begin to discuss, perhaps begin to worry about. There is no hard answer. Were there one, we would not need poetry. But this poem, offsetting love and death, okay, suggests something, definitely, okay, to do, okay, with the relationality between the two things. That every time we fall in love, one of the things we're doing is postponing or cheating death. And every time we contemplate death, one of the things we are doing is amplifying the need for or the opportunities for love in this particular world, because the contemplation of death enhances our apprehension of the preciousness of the life that lies in front of us. Shakespeare doesn't make that particular argument in this particular poem, but has it implicit all the way through as part and parcel of the given of what's undertaken. All the way through, in other words, this poem is underwritten by that human inclination to that concept we discovered yesterday called sorgloful, sorrowful love. Okay, the fact that love carries always within it this condition of longing and of yearning, okay, and which inspires us, okay, the more to resist death, okay, and yet confronting death, the more to lay hands upon, to latch onto the life that we do ourselves have. I'm going to conclude and let us have some time to talk today, because this is a poem which more of you know and which you've at least had the opportunity to see now that you've had the poem sent out to you, by just wanting to draw your attention at the very end to the way in which Shakespeare once again is operating at a level of subliminal or of genius of subliminality, which one requires a kind of critical posture to really pick up on. By noting the rondo, the return of his particular tropic imagery from the iteration of leaves in that very first particular stanza, that time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang. Okay, there's leaves right at the beginning of the sonnet. And how he returns all the way from those leaves to the leaf. Okay, first of all, we must behold the leaves, and he uses the Anglo-Saxon behold, okay, as his verb in the beginning. And then he uses the Latinate, this thou perceivest, which thou must leave ere long. And we come back to that word leave. Now in the much more rationating, scholarly, French-derived, Latin-derived verb perceivest. Okay, perception coming down from the Latin as opposed to beholden coming down from the Anglo-Saxon. The poem has moved from that sensile, tactile, common human Anglo-Saxon peasanty kind of sorglofu with which it began, towards the much more intellectual rationations of the couplet. Okay, we've moved from beholding to perceiving. We've moved from leaves as a noun, as we encounter it in the first stanza in the second line, to leave as a verb in the final line of the poem. And we remember once again in the instance that this being a sonnet is a sonnet, an entity in hand. It is on paper. And as such, it is itself a leaf too, just as we have leaves in a book, or we talk about a leaf of paper. And that this leaf, okay, this sonnet on its particular leaf of paper, its sheet of paper, is hanging by its own thread, its own filaments of words, okay, which are, as it were, those things stringing the sonnet to the bow of the English language itself. It is, in its sequence, one of a few hanging in sequence. And in this particular instance, importantly, it is breathed on in the reading, whether aloud or quietly, because we go on breathing even if we read silently. And it is as if, and this is the all-important point, I think, in the end, to recapitulate in the terms that occur most vividly much later in Shelley's great poem, Ode to the West Wind, that we breathe aloud on these filaments of words, which lie stippling the pages like the ashes themselves of that final trope in that third, penultimate stanza of the poem. We breathe on those ashes in order to reinvigorate the fire for the next day. So just as in the first stanza, when yellow leaves or none or few did hang, could be a concessionary plaintive suggestion that the individual is not as old as perhaps he's making himself out to be, or could be the cipher that there comes a time when a few leaves put out their sprouts and bud in springtime. So to the final image of the poem, of the dying fire consumed by the ash, okay, consumed by that, okay, which nourished it, becomes also potentially an image of resurrection itself. Because that fire, breathed on by the act of reading, may be blown back into life, resurrected from the coals of its former self into the hot fire of a love of ardor or a love of youth. Okay, to reignite by breath, the breath of reading, as Shelley has it famously at the end of his Ode to West Wind. Okay, to breathe on my words, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. And that is, of course, exactly what we've done in this critical act over the last 1 hour. We have breathed upon the ashes of Shakespeare's poem, and in the process reinvigorated a love that is 400 years old. And that is the genius of the poem as I see it. We have a few minutes, so let's see how well we can manage putting our hands up on what's on Microsoft Teams. I'm very happy to take some questions or comments. We seem all quiet. There's always an interesting kind of dynamic with this online medium, whatever, because we're all sitting in our own silences at home. When one's sitting in a seminar room all together, there is a kind of expectant buzz, and all kinds of subliminal signals or whatever suggest by the shuffling in a chair or the turning of a head or whatever that somebody is pregnant with a wonderful thought and is about to let us share it or whatever, and is then encouraged by all the kind of turnings of necks, whatever, so to do. It's very difficult sometimes in the circumstance to solicit that particular commentary. But if there are none, I will, I see something's happened. Bev, what would you like to ask or say?
I just wanted to say that it reminds me of that Emily Dickinson poem, Ashes Denote That Fire Was, and it has that same process in
Exactly.
the Dickinson poem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Once again, this is why I'm calling these things tropes. They're metaphors that are used again and again. Most classically, as I've suggested or whatever, Shelley reinvigorates the sonnet of Shakespeare's under very different circumstances in Ode to the West Wind or whatever, where in the first stanza he talks about the air, in the second stanza he talks about the earth, in the third stanza he talks about water. In the fourth stanza, he recapitulates earth, air, and water, whatever, and we're waiting and we're waiting, we're waiting. Where's this last element? And in the fifth stanza, finally, he gives us just the ashes or whatever of the fire that we're expecting: earth, air, fire, water, and fire. And he talks about blow, be thou to me a trumpet of thy prophecy, whatever, and blow on my words that there might be ashes and sparks, my words among mankind, or whatever. We get this great resurrection imagery, okay, that as the poem's dying down under the weight of its own grey matter of ash, whatever, it comes back to life again. And I would like to suggest, as I have, whatever, that this poem utilizes the same sort of logic.